Hi, everybody. Saturday morning, time for Pastor Paul's Bible Talk. That's how we open it, I guess. Now, Pastor Paul's Bible Talk. Glad you're with me on a Saturday morning. And let's talk Bible. This is sort of my sermon for the week of what we do on our unconventional spiritual journey of the 21st century. And I'm going to talk about this topic today, why I believe Jesus is a bad evangelical. He didn't do things the way evangelicals do things today. And if we call ourselves a Christian, which means one who is like Christ, or one who is trying to become like Christ, or one who is a little Christ, as some say it means, then we ought to know what Christ looks like and try to look like him and think, if he were in America today in the flesh, would he hang out with us and say, you guys are pretty cool? And I think if you look at the evangelical church today and Jesus were here in the flesh on earth, he would say, no, thank you to hanging out with the evangelical church. And that's our topic today for today's Bible Talk. Whoops, sorry. My phone's making some noise here as we're going to pop into a little bit of TikTok. But glad you're with me. I say that Jesus would not be part of the evangelical church were he on earth today. And in fact, I believe that evangelicals would despise Jesus were he on earth today. So let's talk about it on today's Bible Talk, which is our time of looking into the Bible during our weekly journey of spirituality in the 21st century. So I just bless this time with you, that we join our spirits together, and I'm the one talking and presenting to you, not because I'm more brilliant or closer to God or with containing less sin inside the container of this body, but because we're on a journey together to connect our spirits together and connect our spirits to the divinity of heaven together. And so let's join together in wisdom and power and joy in this moment. I'm so glad to be here connected with you. So glad you're here. So, all right, let's go into our Bible Talk today. And the title is Jesus a Bad Evangelical? And I say this because Jesus, in some ways, was the original deconstructionist of his faith. There's this term going around now of deconstruction, and a lot of people are saying, I'm deconstructing my faith. And a lot of Christians are squealing and screaming and saying, oh no, not deconstruction because it's scary. And some of us are saying, no, deconstruction is good, and we'll talk about that today. But many of you are asking me, and it's why we're having a deconstruction webinar coming up this Sunday night, which you can find out more information about in my bio, and a deconstruction discussion group coming up here in the next week. Because many of you are asking me, is it okay for me to deconstruct my faith? And I say yes, because Jesus actually deconstructed the faith of his day. And so I'm going to talk about it from that vantage point, that I think Jesus is a bad evangelical for a whole lot of reasons. I have a whole list of 15 that I'll share with you sometime. But today we're just going to look at from this fact that Jesus was in fact the original deconstructionist. And he was a bad evangelical because he cared more about people than a sin code. And these are the two reasons I'm going to deal with in Bible Talk today as to why I think Jesus was a bad evangelical. And so to start with this idea of Jesus as a deconstructionist, I'm going to start from reading just a couple of verses at the beginning of the gospel, as we're told, of Matthew, probably not written by Matthew, maybe shared with some people from Matthew, but maybe not written exactly by Matthew, but it's the gospel we call the Gospel of Matthew. And in chapter 24 of Matthew, it says, Jesus left the temple and was going away. And when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, Jesus answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So here's what's happening in that moment. And it's really important that we look at what's happening in the moment, because evangelicals tend to not actually know what's happening in the Bible. They read it in these two-dimensional sort of American eyes version of terms. And so some of you may not have kind of understood what's happening here. But, we know that during Passion Week, we celebrate this idea that Jesus, on the Sunday at the beginning of Passion Week, came into Jerusalem, looked around the temple, and we don't know exactly what his response was, but I think he was bothered by what he saw. And so he walked out of the temple, went to Bethany, spent the night with his disciples there, and the next day came into the temple and flipped his lid. He lost it. And I started flipping over tables and grabbed some ropes and started hitting. I've had some discussion with people recently whether he actually was hitting people or just hitting the animals to create chaos. And I had always thought he was actually hitting the people, but somebody made the point to me that it doesn't actually say that in the text. And I'm really big on that. Like, we can't make an assumption, or we can't make at least a declarative of what was happening if it's not actually in the text. And so it's not actually, but in my mind, I like the idea that Jesus was so disturbed by what was being seen in the story of that moment that he stopped, he grabbed some ropes, he wound them together, and he started beating people with it. But whether he did that or not, we know Jesus in the story was extremely disturbed by what he saw in the temple. Now, here's sometime later, it says in Matthew 24 that Jesus left the temple and was going away. Now, again, if you read that without really understanding what was going on and understanding the language in which the Bible was written and what it was saying, you could just heard like, oh, Jesus was at the temple and then he left. But the way this verse is constructed, it was saying Jesus left the temple and he did so vigorously, powerfully, and probably a little angry. And we know now that he never we're never told that he ever went back to the temple again. Like, he rarely went to the temple to engage religious people, but for whatever reason, he was at the temple in this moment, and now he was leaving, and he was leaving in a huff. And he was so disturbed by it that his disciples had to be peacemakers. They're like, oh, we've got to fix this. Jesus is really ticked off. And so they say, Jesus, this is really cool. This Bible is really cool. This temple is really cool. And, this is the place you went when you were like 12 years old, Jesus, and you discussed the Torah and the Septuagint with those brilliant biblical minds. And don't you just remember how great this is? And look, Jesus, look at how amazing these buildings are. So they were just trying to have a discussion with Jesus to make him feel okay. How many of you know, like, sometimes it's okay to not be okay? I just posted a video on my TikTok feed from a young Hispanic woman, a Latina, who is saying, in this season, in this day and age right now, with the extremism going on, that it's not okay to be moderate anymore. Like, it's really a cop-out to be moderate, that you have to take a stand. You're either for the incredible extremism we're seeing on the right, or you're against it. You can't find a space in the middle and say, well, I'm just really okay with both, because they are diametrically opposed to one another. And so sometimes we have to stand up and say, you know what, Christians, your support of Donald Trump is not okay. There's nothing Christian about it. And Jesus here at this moment is really ticked off by what he's seeing from the religious system of his day, a religious system that he was a part of. He was a Pharisaical rabbi. He was a rabbi in the tradition of his people, and he was disgusted by what he saw. And what was it that he was disgusted with? He said, I came to set the captives free from bondage, and this religious system under which I am operating puts people back into bondage, into the bondage of law and rules. And I believe Jesus would say to the evangelical church today, it's not okay. The bondage of rules and law that you're putting on people, the shame of this eternal damnation of hell, it's not okay. I came to set people free from the bondage of religion and connect them directly to heaven. and to God, and to let them work in operation of bringing heaven to earth so the kingdom of heaven can be extant with us. And instead, you've made it into this individualistic, silly, say a prayer and then treat people any way you want, and you're still going to get to go to heaven thing. And that's a bondage of religion and religious exclusivity. And now in the right-wing American church, it's not just a religious exclusivity anymore. It's a political exclusivity as well. And I think Jesus would go into our evangelical churches and he would flip tables over like you've never seen before. Matthew 24 is called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus was on the Mount of Olives overlooking the temple. And, some people have used this to say this is an end times prophecy that Jesus was giving in Matthew 24. And I'm not going to read the rest of the chapter, but I just do want to tell you this because some people, like to say that this was Jesus talking about the end times. It wasn't. He was actually talking about the end of the religious era of the day. And he turned and he said, you like this religious system? Well, I'll tell you what, not a single stone is going to stand upon another. So I get all kinds of criticism for encouraging people to be deconstructionist and to deconstruct their thought process of faith. Jesus turned to the very building that was the center of the nationalistic, racial, religious center of his people. And he said, you see those buildings? Not a stone is going to stand on top of another. And so you want to talk about deconstruction. I haven't declared any building is going to be torn down. Now, I do declare that in the next 2 generations, I don't think people are going to be going to the evangelical buildings anymore because most millennials and Gen Zers are now saying, hey, your church in a building is completely irrelevant to us. You mean nothing to us. They're very spiritual generations, but they're turning away from Christianity, not because they're bad, but because they can't stand Christians anymore. And I think Jesus would say, you can hold to your political beliefs all day long and think your anti-abortionist stance makes you good with God. But I'm telling you, you chasing away those young people from the church makes you terrible in my eyes. That's why Jesus would not be an evangelical, because he wanted to deconstruct not only the religious system, but the building that was the center of the racial religious system, racial nationalistic religious system. So he turned and said, you see these beautiful buildings? They're going to be torn down. So let me tell you something about the temple when Jesus was on earth. There were 3 temples in Jerusalem that we read about in the Bible. And the first one was Solomon. Solomon probably, some say, had a higher percentage of the world's wealth than any human being that's ever existed on the planet. He built an unbelievable temple, probably should be one of the 8 wonders of the world. I don't know how they determine that stuff or whatever, but he built this amazing temple, and people loved it, and they loved it so much that when Zerubbabel and Ezra then built the second temple after the Babylonians had wiped the temple out, the people that were old enough to remember the first temple cried when they saw it because it was such a bad representation of the first one. So the temple that Jesus is talking about here then now is the third temple. And it actually was the second temple with King Herod took and improved and made better. So King Herod was the perfect Donald Trump. He was a pandering non-Jew or half-Jew who wanted to be in the good graces of the Jewish religious system. So he pandered to them. He told them whatever they wanted to hear. And he spent 80 years. He was an amazing developer builder. And he took 80 years to improve the temple to make it as magnificent as in Solomon's day. 80 years they worked on improving the temple. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that for 8 years straight, Herod had 10,000 men working on the temple every day. For 8 years, 10,000 men working on the temple every single day. And so he built this incredible temple, inlaid with gold in the best marble. And Josephus said that when the sun shone on the temple, nobody could look upon the temple because the gold was so amazing. And if you were in the distance, the marble was so white that you would swear there was snow on the temple. And so this is this incredible building, and the people of Jesus' religious system, nationalistic system, and racial system had this as the center of their world, the temple in Jerusalem. And so it meant so much to them. And all of a sudden, Jesus turned around and said, "You guys think this is great? What it contains is such an abomination and an affront to the goodness of heaven. I'm telling you, not a single stone is going to stand upon another." And within just a few decades, he was absolutely right. The building was completely torn down. The Romans, so the people of Israel had revolted and revolted and revolted against Rome. And finally, Rome said, "Okay, we've had enough." They laid siege to the city of Jerusalem in about 66 AD. And it was one of the worst, most tragic times in history ever. It says that the siege put such an economic pressure on the city of Jerusalem that mothers were eating their babies. It was just a horrible, horrible thing. But because of the Olivet Discourse, we're told, Christians, when the Romans came and laid siege, and there were prophets prophesying, God is on our side, the Romans are not going to be able to take us, the Christians were like, nope, Jesus told us when this happened, we needed to run for the hills, so we're out. And so while the siege was happening, the Christians got out of the city, and they survived the siege, we're told, while the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD utterly, completely destroyed, and the temple set on fire, even though the leader of the Roman army didn't want the temple destroyed because it was such a magnificent building, but it was set fire to, in part because a lot of the Jewish people were running into the temple thinking, well, they'll never destroy the temple. But Jesus said there would not be one stone left upon another. And as the fire started, the gold began to melt into the cracks of the marble. And so the Roman soldiers took every stone one off of another so they could get the spoils of war and get the gold, and destroyed the building to such an incredible extent that today we're not exactly sure where the foundation is. There's just a little bit of a wall left that we now call the Wailing Wall. And as Jesus said, that temple was completely destroyed. So if you want to know what a deconstructionist looks like in toto, Jesus said, hey, not only is the religious system going to be destroyed, but the building that houses it will be destroyed. And so why did that happen? Why was Jesus so opposed to this system? It was an exclusive, centering belief system. I mean, we see it back at Sinai that God is saying to the Israelites, now I'm going to make you my priest of the whole world. And the Israelites are like, no, we don't want that. We want to have a God that's going to be our God against our enemies, like our enemies have. We want to have an exclusive God that's just for us. And we're told in that story that God then is like, okay, if you want to have that relationship, I'm going to have to give you a bunch of rules and punish you if you don't follow those rules. And so about 600 Levitical laws and rules came down the pike that showed what an unbelievable system, ridiculously terrible system it was. And we're told in the book of Hebrews that idea of sacrificing a lamb, of blood sacrifice to pay for sins, was never God's intention. And it was never a way to pay for sins. That was not God's plan. And Jesus came to tell everybody, hey, this religious system isn't the way you're supposed to operate with each other or with the divine. It's supposed to be a partnership of making it on earth as it is in heaven, of bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth so that it will be as it is in heaven. And instead, the religious leaders of the day had made it into this very exclusive, very self-focused, nationalistic, race-based religious exclusivity that said, we need to take over the government of Israel, make Israel great again, and then God's plan can move forward in the world. Sound like any other religious system you know? A religious system that says, our religious laws need to become the law of the land. We need to be in charge of the country. Our cultural norm, our Euro-white cultural norm, religious system needs to be in charge of the country so that God's plan can exist on earth? Does that remind you of any other religious system you've ever heard of? That's why I say Jesus was a bad evangelical. He said, hey, I came to set people free from this bondage, and you're putting them back into another bondage of religion. And the bad evangelical Jesus would say the same to evangelicalism today and right-wing Christianity, and would say it's time to tear this thing down. Now, I made a mistake because I said Jesus was the original deconstructionist, but actually, there were many deconstructionists before Jesus. Jeremiah, for one, was one who in Jeremiah 5 said, hey, a bad thing is happening in the land. The prophets are prophesying falsely. The priests, the leaders are leading from what the prophets are saying. And my people like it that way. So it's time to tear this system down. And it finishes that chapter of Jeremiah chapter 5 saying, what will you do when the end comes? Jesus wasn't the original deconstructionist. I actually made a mistake there. He was the original deconstructionist of Christianity, perhaps. But Jeremiah was a deconstructionist. Isaiah was a deconstructionist. Amos, for sure, was a deconstructionist. And so let me tell you, if you're a deconstructionist in your faith today, you are in good company with a long line of people. John the Baptist, who looked at the religious leaders and said, you are a brood of vipers, was a deconstructionist. And certainly Jesus, who said, you know who your dad is? Your dad, religious leaders, is the devil. That is a deconstructionist. And so we can follow in Jesus' footsteps. And here's a very important point. Christians will come after you when you start to deconstruct the faith. They'll tell you, oh, you're doing it because you just want to sin with impunity. So I ask you, did Jesus deconstruct religion because he wanted to sin? Or he wanted to be free from religious rules that the book of Romans tells us create sin? They don't get rid of sin. They create more opportunity for sin. And did Jesus want to set other people free from that? And this whole thing about, well, deconstructionists, you guys are just hurt. That's why you're doing this, because you're hurt, is such, excuse my language, I know it's tough for some of you Christians, but it's such bullshit. So ridiculous. I want to play a clip for you from a guy named Sean Mcdowell, Dr. Sean Mcdowell. When you hear this, you're just going, I love how Christians, like, they learn to talk really fast and then slow to make their Christian point. And you give it the little whisper at the end. He's expert at it. He's one of the best. He'll be talking, then he'll slow and he'll move into his point. I don't know if we'll have that in this clip or not, but he's so good at it. It just makes me cringe. It's nails on the chalkboard to me. But this was a video that was sent to me by a friend recently. And again, it's making the point that, oh, if you're deconstructing, it's because you're wounded and hurt and you need help from God. And so listen to what Dr. Sean Mcdowell says about deconstructionists being hurt.
Right. With that said, one question I have when I hear this talk about cancel culture is, why now? What is it that we find ourselves in this moment where cancel culture is all the rage and it's captured our society? And I think of the movie in 2000, The Perfect Storm. It was based upon a 1991 storm off the coast of Massachusetts. And it's called The Perfect Storm because at least two fronts that were themselves massive moved in the same place at the same time and created a huge storm. In fact, in the movie, it's about a boat that has this catch. And if they wait through the storm, they won't make it home. So they rush through thinking they can make it, but the storm is just too big and too powerful. So perfect storm is this idea of certain things coalesce in the same place at the same time and create a certain phenomena. Well, I think we have cancel culture because certain things have been moving into the same place at the same time. And in fact, when I think about our culture, it makes perfect sense that we have cancel culture. I'd be surprised if we didn't. So what are those factors moving together that create cancel culture? I think there's 3 of them, and I think the first one is we have a mental health epidemic in America. And by that, I mean we have a lot of hurting people in the church and outside of the church. And COVID has only exacerbated what was already moving and becoming a hockey stick exponential growth. Loneliness, depression, anxiety, stress, suicidality, anger, fatherlessness. Friends, I heard one teenager named Faith Ann say, she said, my whole generation is like a bunch of little volcanoes. You know what that means? That means right below the surface. There's hurt and there's stress and anxiety, and they're about to explode. Pastor Rick Warren said something I think of almost daily. He said, hurt people hurt people. Why do we have cancel culture taking place? Because we have a culture of people who have been canceled and who have been hurt and barring forgiveness. And the power of the Holy Spirit, human nature, is when we've been hurt to turn around and hurt other people.
Isn't he good at that? Isn't he amazing at that voice? And I think we're having it today because, but to get what he's saying, he built what he spoke around cancel culture, because cancel culture, it's so funny to me how right-wing people, and particularly right-wing Christians, coalesce around words. So cancel culture, you don't have to say anything, just cancel culture, and then everybody goes, oh. And so he's equating deconstruction to cancel culture. And he's saying that we have cancel culture because people are hurting. They're hurting out there. And so we have to quit hurting. And what is he totally ignoring? That people are leaving because people like Sean Mcdowell are full of shit. I'm sorry. Some of you like the Bible without like the curse words, but he's missing that people are leaving because they're just not buying the narrative anymore, because the lives of the church are not demonstrating what's happening. So you say, well, have you been hurt by the church? You know, you must be deconstructing because you've been hurt by the church. Well, let me tell you something. I have been hurt by the church, the big C church and the little C churches that I've gone to. I have been hurt. Yes, that does not invalidate my opinion about the church. Oh, Christians are cruel beyond any other human beings out there. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could say the Taliban hanging people from cranes. Okay, I'll give that to you. But Christian love is one of the cruelest things going out there. Try being a senior pastor of a church sometime, as I was. There is no cruelty like the love of Christians. And people are leaving in droves because your lack of love for humanity is betraying the fact that you don't believe your own story that you even have wrong in the first place. But because Christians cannot be introspective and say, is it me? We have to look outward and say, it's them, it's the world. Then we have to come up with an explanation. So we use words like cancel culture and hurt to try to label and invalidate the voice of those who disagree. So let me tell you, somebody who was hurt by the church, and we don't invalidate that opinion, and that person is Jesus. Jesus was exponentially hurt by the church. Let me read from Luke chapter 4, where Jesus finally steps up and says, hey, you know that Messiah you've been talking about all this time? I'm him. And when he said this, he was in his hometown of Nazareth, and people were excited, and they're like, oh my gosh, did you hear that? That was amazing. And then they started going, but wait a second. Aren't you Jesus? Like, didn't we hang out when we were kids? And you're telling me you're the Messiah? And he starts to criticize the religious system by saying, hey, when we had that that time without rain, and Elijah helped that woman who was not one of us. Why? Because she was more pure-hearted than we were. And this other, when Elisha cleansed the leper Naaman, he was a Syrian. Why wasn't Elisha doing those miracles for us? Because we are full of it. And it says in Luke chapter 4, when they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath. They could not hear a message that disagreed with their narrative. They were filled with wrath. How filled with wrath were they? It says, and they rose up and drove Jesus out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built so they could throw him down the cliff. This is what religion does to you. Wow, this is amazing. My heart is filled with this guy saying he's the Messiah. This is incredible. And then somebody goes, wait a second, Messiah, that's Mary's boy, Jesus. You remember him? We played Little League together. And all of a sudden, that went away. And Jesus starts saying, hey, by the way, your religious system is bad. And let me give you a couple of explanations why it's bad. And their response was they became filled with wrath. Because when you're in a religious system, in a community, you have to defend the narrative at all cost. And when somebody starts speaking against it, you become filled with wrath. You have to label them. You have to destroy them in some way. You have to discredit them in some way. And in this particular instance, they were going to take Jesus and throw him off the cliff. And then I love Luke 4, verse 30. It says, but passing through their midst, he went away. How did he just walked through the crowd and went away? It's almost like he became invisible and just walked through the crowd somehow, or something happened that made them think, I can't be this way. But was Jesus hurt by the church? Does that invalidate his opinion about it? No Christian would say that's true. No Christian would say, oh, you're right, Jesus was hurt by the church. He must have been just speaking out of his anger, like Sean Mcdowell says, out of his anger. I love that preaching stuff. How hurt was Jesus? In Hebrews chapter 5, it says, in his days on earth in the flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud wails and tears. Jesus was hurting because he was a rabbi who was an outcast to the religion for which he was a rabbi. Yet no Christian would say his opinion is invalid because of his pain. One time, Jesus even had to look at his own mother, the Virgin Mary, and say, you know what? That's not my mom. She doesn't believe in me. Her and those boys out over there who think they're my brothers, they're not my family. Many of you have lost family and relatives to right-wing thought, and it's been painful in the middle of your deconstruction. Just know Jesus felt that pain in the story we read in the Gospels, that he even had to tell his mother and brothers, you guys aren't my family. The people who I'm with here, who are with me and on this journey with me and love me and respect me for what I'm doing, that's my family. And if you can't respect me for who I am, you're not my family. Yes, Jesus was hurt. They even chose the January 6th insurrection crowd of Barabbas over Jesus. Jesus was incredibly hurt by the church, but that did not make his deconstruction invalid. And I've been hurt incredibly by the Christianity I grew up in as a kid, and the Christianity that I served in as a senior pastor for 10 years and as sort of a head layperson for 25. Incredibly hurt that I've had to work through in some deep sorrow and agony. And in no way does that invalidate my opinion about deconstruction and the truth of the story of the Bible, no matter how many times Sean Mcdowell comes through with that amazing Christian whisper at the end of a sentence. Sorry. I just can't stop that. I think that's so much fun. All right, I got to start wrapping this thing up, but I do want to share one thing with you. I'm talking about Jesus, the Deconstructionist, and I have a deconstruction webinar coming up this weekend. And so I just want to real quickly acknowledge that. It's a free webinar called Jesus, the Bad Evangelical, a Deconstruction U webinar. It's this Sunday, 5:30 Pacific. It's absolutely free. And I want you to come join me. And we're going to talk about, is it okay to deconstruct? I'm going to lay out, and those of you who are watching on YouTube right now, you can see the 9 major themes of deconstruction that we're going to look over. And, number one is deconstruction. Is it okay? We're going to talk about how can I be right and all those Christians be wrong and some other things. But this Sunday is going to be the start of that with Jesus, the Bad Evangelical, a Deconstruction U webinar. And that will lead into a discussion group we're having on the other side that will have some cost on it. And we'll talk about that at the webinar on Sunday. But the webinar Sunday, absolutely free. Jesus, the Bad Evangelical. And I hope you'll join me. If you go into my bio or onto my website, pastor-paul.com, you can see the information there and join us on Sunday in the webinar. I also want to tell you just very quickly that you can help support what we do financially. And what I do is a little bit different. And I know talking about money always makes some people uncomfortable, but I have children to feed like everybody else. And this is what I do for a living. And so for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see the QR codes that can take you to my Venmo if you want to give a gift, or to my Patreon page. And you can get to the link on the link tree in my bio for Patreon. You can subscribe for as low as $5.99 a month to help support our message that God is not mad at you. And you get some cool stuff for being a subscriber. And what I do that's different is I'm not a 501c3. I pay taxes on the money I bring in. I'm a for-profit pastor because I for a couple of reasons, I believe in paying my taxes. I want to be a part of participating in helping finance our roads and our schools in my community and in our state. And I feel like pastors who opt out of that, I can't make a blatant statement that it's wrong, but I think it's a system that's being abused. And for me, I just want to pay taxes. I want to be a part of supporting my neighborhood and my community and my state. So that's one reason why I do this for profit and do it as a subscription rather than passing the plate or going out and wrestling up support like many missionaries do. And the other reason is because I want to be able to share whatever is on my heart to say. If I want to say, I think it's anti-Christ to make justifications for supporting Donald Trump, who is an amoral and incompetent leader, I want to be able to say that without being in violation of my 501c3 covenant with culture. I think many churches violate their not-for-profit covenant with culture by talking about politics and by having 75 to 80% of their budget going to salary and building maintenance. So I don't like being a hypocrite. And so I want you to know that because of that, and because I don't want to violate my covenant with culture, you don't get a tax write-off for giving me support. And I do it in different ways to give you subscriptions instead. But I do ask you consider, if you enjoy what I do and would like me to be able to do this, and the weekly podcast and the weekly spiritual mindfulness moments in the Sunday community, consider joining my Patreon for as little as $5.99 a month and help support the message that God is not mad at you. And it'll mean an awful lot to me. All right, we'll finish it up here. Just a few more minutes of why I say Jesus is a bad evangelical. I actually love the title, Jesus, the very, 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 very bad evangelical, because I think he was very bad. And so one of the reasons I just shared on is because Jesus was one of the original deconstructionists of religion. And so evangelicals would just hate him passionately for that. And the other reason is he cared more about people than he did about sin from people. Jesus wasn't into a legalistic moral code, and he wasn't into a nationalistic, race-based, exclusive religion that wanted to take over the government either. So I'm going to talk about a story from the book of John chapter 4, and I'm not going to read from the Bible for it, but I just want to tell you about the story, and it's the story we call the woman at the well. And this is a story where Jesus and his disciples, come into a town, and the disciples go to find food, and Jesus sits at the well where there is a Samaritan woman drawing water at a weird moment of the day. Most women came at the same time, so because it was a community event, sort of, it was at the cooler portion of the day they would come and get the water needed for the household from the communal well. Well, here was a lady who had come by herself in the heat of the day to get water, and that probably was because she was an outcast in the community, and she was a Samaritan woman. So know two things about Jesus sitting with a Samaritan woman at the well. First off, no good Jewish Israelite in the days of the first century would ever be caught sitting with a woman who was not their wife. Now, they might go have sex with that woman somewhere, as we find out in some other stories in the Bible, but they would never be seen in public with her, because you were not to be in the proximity of a woman with whom you were not married. And so here's Jesus, a rabbi. So even more so for him as a rabbi to be sitting and having a conversation with a woman. And by the way, women, much like the evangelical church today, were treated extremely second class and not considered equal with men who, and so she was a woman. She was a second-class citizen as a woman, and like Mike Pence, Jesus should not have been sitting with her because, I don't know, lust could jump from her onto him, and it would be her fault rather than his. But here was Jesus sitting with this woman at the well in violation of his cultural standards and his moral standing as a rabbi. But even more so, she was a Samaritan woman. So let's think about who the Samaritans were when the Israelites were taken away from their homeland by Babylon and taken into captivity before they came back years later. There were people left behind, a remnant of people who lived in the land, and many of them were Jewish people who then married people outside of the race and the religion, and they then made this group of people called the Samaritans from Samaria, that the Jewish people considered to be definitely second-class citizens. They would be looked at much like maybe evangelicals would look at the Islamic community today and say, you guys are not equal with us because God doesn't like you. And Jesus' friends definitely would have said, you don't hang out with a Samaritan because they bastardized our race and our religion. And so it was terrible to hang out with a Samaritan. And here's a rabbi, not only hanging out with a woman, but a Samaritan woman. And when the disciples came back, they said, what is Jesus doing sitting with this person? But here he is, Jesus sitting with the Samaritan woman. So right away, the evangelicals would hate him. And we know the religious system of Jesus' day hated Jesus because he hung out with sinners and not with them. And evangelicals today hate very much that I hang out with you sinners on TikTok and on YouTube, instead of with them and in their narrative. And even more so then when Jesus sits and has a conversation with this woman, he says to her, go get your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, that's right. You've lived with 5 men. You've had 5 husbands before, and now you're living with a man with whom you're not married. So my evangelical friends go, see, Jesus called out her sin. He called out her sin. Do you see that? Well, what they miss in the exchange and the text of the gospel is her response sure doesn't sound like somebody to me who's being condemned for her lifestyle. What's her response? You're right, Jesus. I shouldn't be living with this man. I'm terrible that I've been divorced. I'm just a horrible woman. You're right, Jesus. Could you lead me in a sinner's prayer so I could repent? No. Let me do a Sean Mcdowell. Did Jesus call her to repent? No. Her response is, wow. How did you know that about me? How did you know those details of my life? You must be a prophet. Let's talk. And after their conversation, what was her response to Jesus? I'm so convicted of my sin. I must change my life. No, there's nothing in the story that says she intends to change her life. What happens in the story of the Bible is she goes and gets all her friends and say, come meet this man that told me everything I've ever done. You got to meet this guy. He's amazing. He's going to tell you things about your life and you're going to love it. Evangelicals, when you have your love the sinner, hate the sin conversations with people, are those their responses to you? Do they respond with, wow, something amazing and mystical is happening at this moment. I want to know more. And is their response like, let me go get my friends to come back and meet you? And do they go tell their friends, come meet this amazing guy who told me I'm a sinner? That is not the response of culture. So maybe you're right. Maybe culture is just terrible and horrible and you're the only ones that are good. But I suspect something much deeper, that you're not doing it right. And you're not doing it the way Jesus did it. Because of this, I say to you, Jesus was a very, very bad evangelical. When Jesus was with the thieves on the cross and one of them said, hey, why don't you, if you're the Messiah, get down from this cross and take us with you. And the other one said, this guy's not guilty. We're guilty. He's not guilty. Why don't you stop saying things like that? Jesus turns to the one who stood up for him and says, hey, today you're going to be with me in paradise. Evangelicals would say, see, Jesus cared about people doing the right thing. He's going to take that guy with him to heaven. Well, first off, you have to understand what paradise meant to the first century Jewish religion, and it wasn't an eternal heaven that evangelicals believe in. It was more of like a holding tank while you were getting refined after life on this earth. Maybe what Catholics would call purgatory. Jesus didn't say, you're going to be with me in heaven eternally from now on because of what you did today. By the way, Jesus never asked him to say a sinner's prayer either, just to help you out with that, evangelicals. But he didn't say, because of what you said, you're now going to be eternally with me in heaven. And the guy didn't say, take me to heaven. He said, when you come into your kingdom as the Messiah, let me be with you. This guy wasn't asking to go to heaven. He was asking to be a part of the Messiah's reign on this earth. Now, here's the other thing that didn't happen. Jesus didn't turn to the other thief and said, hey, you better repent or you're going to hell. Somehow evangelicals fill in that space, but it's not in the text. He didn't say, you're going to heaven and you're going to hell, by the way, guys. No, he told the one guy, you want to be a part of my kingdom? When I come into reign, hey, today you're going to be with me in paradise. And the other guy, he didn't ask to be a part of Jesus' kingdom on earth. He just said, hey, if you're really the Messiah, get us down from here. And yeah, he probably said it mocking as all hell. But we add into the story our narrative. The good thief was going to heaven for eternity with Jesus. The bad thief was going to hell for eternal damnation. And neither of those things were happening. And because of that, Jesus would tell a different story than the evangelical church is telling. And they would say, Jesus, you're a bad evangelical. Let's stop making the Bible say things it doesn't say. Why does all this matter? Because I think there's something incredible happening in the world right now. There are a ton of people. I never imagined when I'm just at about a year of lighting up my TikTok feed, and I never in a million years imagined that I was going to find this incredible community of people who say, hey, something is wrong with the religious belief system that I grew up with. I thought I was one of very few people in the world that was in this process of thinking things differently about the evangelical church, because everybody around me told me I was a terrible person for doing it. Those Christians who loved me. But I found out there's this incredible thing happening that I don't know if it's hundreds of thousands or millions. I suspect it's a whole freaking lot of people are starting to say, church, you are so screwed up. I can't be a part of this anymore. And they're stepping out of the church building and they're saying not one stone left on top of another in that thing. And they're saying, but I still have a belief that there's something out there. We call it God. Maybe it's not the patriarchal God that we made up, but there's something, and I want to be connected to that. And what does that look like in this season? And I think it's amazing that it's happening. And evangelicals want to curse it and make it go away. And I say to you, deconstructing Christian, deconstructing Mormon, deconstructing Jehovah's Witness, deconstructing Catholic, you go. You deconstruct and you say, that thing is not for me anymore. But what does the unconventional spiritual life of the 21st century looks like? That's what I want to see. Can we do that? So if you're deconstructing, let me root you on. Let me be your champion. I'm 56 years old. For 10 years, I led a church that I planted. For 25 years, I was in church leadership. For my entire life, I've been in the middle of the evangelical church. And I tell you that what I believed as a young person and even what I believed as a senior leader, although it was very different from what I believed as a young person, I believe very differently from that now. And I don't believe I'm wrong. Now, I believe what I believe today, probably in another 10 years, that'll change too. Because I think we're always getting different facets of what this life looks like. We should always be learning new things. Romans 12:2-3 says, don't be conformed to the age in which you live. Don't be conformed to your bubble or your echo chamber, but be transformed by the ongoing renewing of your mind so that you can know the good and perfect will, what is right in the season. Think. God won't be mad at you if you think. God's not telling you be more concerned about being deceived than to value learning and being with people who believe differently than you do, to show love for your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is a bad evangelical because he loved people. He didn't love theology. He didn't love rules. He didn't love putting rules and condemnation on people. He loved setting them free from it. That's the amazing thing about the story. That's the thing I won't let go of. Even if somebody wants to tell me, well, Jesus may not have even existed. Great, fine. I'll tell you what, the story is still freaking amazing. And it still inspires me toward my best self. And if I can just get the idiots who keep trying to make it this legalistic, nationalistic, race-based monstrosity that evangelicalism has become, we can do amazing things together. Whether you believe in Christ or whatever you believe in, I think we can run together and see the world changed for the better, because that's ultimately what Jesus told us to do. That it said of his coming to the end of government, to the end of the increase of his government and of peace, there would be none. It would never end, that it would get better and better and better. And that's what I bless. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see how you can help support the ministry there. Just point your phone at a QR code. Join my Patreon page. We'll do a lot of fun stuff together. I hope you've enjoyed this time. I speak blessing. I speak blessing over this time we've had together, and say yes to loving each other and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Amen.